Central Park is the most famous city park in the world. But did you know, of its 843 acres, every single tree, shrub, and flower were placed by design and not by nature? I'm Michael Weitzner. I've been an architect in New York City for over 35 years. And today, I'm going to show you some of the hidden details that make Central Park the greatest metropolitan park in the world. In the 1840s, the concept for a large-scale park in Manhattan was proposed by poet William Cullen Bryant and one of the fathers of American landscape architecture, Andrew Jackson Downing. Their dream would come to life in the 1850s when the city of New York held a design competition for the Central Park on the island of Manhattan. Over 30 entries were submitted, and the ultimate winner was the park as we know it today, designed by landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted and architect Calvert Vaux. Behind me is the Dairy. This may not be one of the most famous buildings in the park, but it has a tangible connection to one of the initial requirements of the design competition, and is part of what made Vaux and Olmsted's design so ingenious and distinct from the other submissions. This building is in the center of the Children's District, which was incorporated into the design after the competition in order to accommodate younger visitors to the park. The Dairy was a place for children to have access to fresh milk, which at the time, in the late 1800s, was not something everybody had. And you can see it has a bit of a Brothers Grimm fairy tale feeling to it. But there's another part of this building that you can't see, that extends down 2 stories to the ground just on the other side of that fence, where it meets one of the transverse roads that allow traffic to cut through the park. A transverse road is basically just a road that allows traffic to cross through the park, which is important because the park covers 51 city blocks north to south. The original design competition required a minimum of 4 transverse roads across the park. Everybody else essentially left them on the surface, which cut the park into basically 5 equal pieces. Vaux and Olmsted's design was the only one that designed them in such a way that the traffic would be on a lower level than the rest of the park, essentially submerging them so that the immersion and nature of park guests would not be disturbed. This piece of iron sticking out of this boulder is not an oversight. In fact, it's a survey bolt that marks the original street grid of Manhattan. The original Commissioner's Plan of 1811 never included designs for a large park in the middle of the city. But the streets that were once here were removed, and the land was incorporated into the park, and it was really quite a transformation. At the time this park was conceived, the entire city wasn't as densely populated as it is today. But there were still settlements in the area that would become the park, including Seneca Village, one of the earliest free black settlements in New York. Everyone living on what would become park land was relocated by eminent domain, the controversial government mechanism for seizing property where owners are compensated but must vacate. And Seneca Village, tragically, was included in that. But it wasn't just relocating homes that took place. Vaux and Olmsted's design called for a radical departure in the thinking of what a grand civic garden should be. They rejected the idea of highly formal, rigid gardens like those designed exclusively for the wealthy. Instead, they proposed a naturalistic setting, filled with meadows, woodlands, gurgling streams, and surprising vistas. The resulting work involved shifting over 5 million cubic yards of soil, planting over 500,000 trees and shrubs, and excavating more than 7 lakes and other bodies of water, all done by hand. In fact, the boulders like this one, which the bolt is sticking out of, are the only original pieces of natural landscape in the park. And even many of these were unearthed, scraped, and cleaned to appear as they do today. This is the last remaining survey bolt in Central Park, and I don't want to spoil the fun of finding it for you, so I'll let you search the 843 acres for it. Central Park is a big place, and it's easy to get turned around. But if you do, here's a tip. There are more than 1,800 lampposts in the park that tell you where you are, if you know where to look. At the base of the lamppost, you can find a set of numbers that indicate where you are in the park. But it's a bit of a secret code. The first 2 numbers represent the nearest cross street between 59th Street and 110th. And the last 2 numbers tell you which side of the park you're on. Even numbers mean east, and odd numbers mean west. Over my shoulder, you could see the Bethesda Terrace, at the center of which is the beautiful Bethesda Fountain. A grand fountain was also one of the original requirements for the design competition. And this one satisfies that requirement and commemorates the importance of water in New York City. Titled Angel of the Waters, this sculpture was created by sculptor Emma Stebbins, who was the first woman to receive a commission for a major public work in New York City. The statue commemorates the completion of the Croton Aqueduct in 1842, which brought fresh water to New York City, which was actually a really big deal because before that, cholera and yellow fever were a big issue because of unclean water. And in fact, Bethesda Terrace takes its name from the Gospel of St. John, which refers to the healing waters of Bethesda in Jerusalem. Although now it is filled with sculptures depicting historical figures such as William Shakespeare, Robert Burns, and Sir Walter Scott, Angel of the Waters was the only sculpture that was created as part of the original design of the park. And even though this statue was created by a woman, all of the statues depicting real people in the park were only of men, until the statue of Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was created in 2020. These later statues line possibly the most recognizable part of the park, known as the Mall, which has been featured in countless films and TV shows. This is one of the most formal design elements of the park, a grand promenade that leads directly to Bethesda Terrace, which the designers called the heart of the park. The city was reluctant to build the terrace at first due to costs, but Vaux convinced them by saying nature first, second, and third, architecture after a while. And basically what that means is nature has been the priority, but at some point we need some architecture. And this became the place for it. The design of the arcade is like the nave of a church, but submerged. It has this incredible ceiling with over 15,000 tiles made in England by the Minton Tile Company, who famously made tiles for many cathedral floors in Europe. This arcade is actually the only place in the world where these tiles are used for ceiling. Although it is highly ornate and ingeniously designed, it also remains true to the naturalistic vision of the park's overall design, with carvings depicting natural scenes as well as symbols of the Four Seasons. The act of walking down these steps through the arcade and out to the terrace is one of the great architectural experiences in New York City. You walk down the stately mall, step down into this dimly lit underground space. Basically, you're just walking under a roadway, and suddenly you're in this church-like, almost sacred space. The rows of stone arches, the imported English tile ceiling, the intricate trompe-l'oeil panels, it all creates an atmosphere of reverence. And then when you emerge, it opens onto this grand terrace with the statue of an angel set against the backdrop of the lake and the forest in the distance. Over my shoulder is what's known simply as the lake. It's actually only 4 feet deep, but it covers 22 acres. So in addition to the lake, there's 6 other man-made bodies of water in the park, including the Harlem Mere, the loch, the reservoir, the pond, and others. And they were all intended to have a calming effect, echoing the serenity of natural bodies of water in the natural landscape. But of course, none of this is naturally occurring. It was all designed and constructed. Even the beautiful waterfalls that you see in Central Park are fed by tap water. You can actually drink them. The idea to create naturalistic vistas throughout the park was partly inspired by the paintings of the Hudson River School. These paintings were enormous in scale and depicted awe-inspiring natural scenes. Some of them are hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which of course is situated inside the park. In fact, the original Met building was designed by Calvert Vaux, along with Jacob Ray Mould. The other notable feature about this lake is the bridge that crosses it, the Bow Bridge. It was originally designed as a suspension bridge, like the Brooklyn Bridge, but they decided to go with an arched bridge because they were concerned that the towers would distract from the naturalistic setting. The whole bridge is cast iron with a span of 87 feet. It's actually the second oldest cast iron bridge in the United States. There's over 36 bridges in the park. Known as arches, most of them are both bridges and tunnels, which is a very New York thing. Each one is unique and ornate and has its own personality and character. But even more importantly, they are also very clearly visible examples of the way the park is organized for visitors to navigate it. There's actually 4 vertical layers to the park. The transverse roads, which are submerged below grade, and 3 other circulation paths. The drives, which were intended for horses and carriages, the bridle paths for horseback riding, and the footpaths for pedestrian traffic. These arches, these bridges and tunnels, intertwine vertically so that these different circulation paths can cross each other without creating traffic at the intersections. The drives pass over the bridle and footpaths, allowing uninterrupted use of each different circulation path. It's also a really clever way to separate these different types of transit while maintaining a seemingly pastoral landscape. And so it actually accommodates a lot of traffic without it feeling like there's a lot of traffic. Vaux and Olmsted intended the park to be enjoyed by all the people of the city, working class and wealthy. But at the time, an unfortunate byproduct of these vertically layered circulation paths was that they also separated the classes from one another, because people of lesser means couldn't afford horses, let alone carriages. Thankfully, that is no longer the case, and the paths are used interchangeably by everybody from all walks of life. So behind me, you can see Belvedere Castle. Belvedere basically just means beautiful view in Italian. It's built on Vista Rock, one of the highest points in Central Park. It was intended as a place to get broad, sweeping views of the park and the surrounding cityscape. There are many places in the park where you can lose sight of the buildings that surround you and feel removed from the city. But climbing the tower of Belvedere Castle brings modern Manhattan back into view and reminds you that this natural landscape sits within a great metropolitan city. The other function of this high vantage point is that Belvedere Castle serves as a weather station. So every time you hear the amount of rainfall or snowfall in Central Park, they are referring to that spot right behind me. The castle is made out of Manhattan schist, which is the same stone found throughout the park, like the boulder that the survey bolt is driven into. And it appears to actually grow out of that rock and become a building. What's really interesting about this building is that it's built at 3/4 scale, which makes it appear further away than it actually is, and gives it this sort of magical fairy tale quality. Originally, it was designed to be 2 castles, but the budget was cut, and Jacob Ray Mould designed that wooden pavilion in lieu of the second castle. Some of the other things you can see from the castle is the Great Lawn, the Delacorte Theater, where they perform Shakespeare in the park, and Turtle Pond, which actually is home to turtles. The Great Lawn was actually a reservoir when the park was first built. But in 1931, they filled it in with rubble from the excavation for the foundations of Rockefeller Center and the 8th Avenue subway. And now, this beautiful green expanse is the site of many famous concerts and home to a number of sports fields and other community activities. You can also see the Ramble from the tower of Belvedere Castle. The Ramble is one of the parts of the park that feels the most like it's always been here, like it's completely natural and not man-made, and that you could get lost on a walk in the woods. And it's the perfect manifestation of the idea that a soothing walk in nature could happen right in the middle of New York City. There's so many amazing things in Central Park that we just didn't have time to cover. If you'd like to see a part 2 on Central Park, let us know in the comments below. Just 200 years ago, Central Park didn't exist. But what you might not know is that you could still see evidence of 13,000 years of world history right here, just by taking a walk in the park. I'm Michael Weitzner. I'm an architect, and today we're going to be taking a walk through time in New York Central Park. We're standing here at the Columbus Circle entrance to Central Park in New York City, where Broadway intersects 59th Street and Central Park West. This was formerly called Grand Circle, and also just the Circle. This is the most famous entrance of the park, in part because of that connection to Broadway. But Broadway has actually been a thoroughfare in New York City long before Central Park existed. In fact, it goes back to before the city was called New York, and even before it was called New Amsterdam. The native Lenape people living on this island traveled this very same route for generations, making this one of the busiest paths on the island for around 13,000 years. When early Dutch colonizers learned about it, they called it the Wanatch-Giwiok Trail, in reference to the tribe of Wappinger people who lived on the bank of the Hudson River. Today, Broadway is famous for many reasons. It is synonymous with theater, and it was the first street in New York City with electric street lamps. But for architects and city planners, one of its most important distinctions is the way it cuts across the street grid of Manhattan at a diagonal. But what might surprise you is that this portion of Broadway is one of the only roads in Manhattan that runs true north. Although Manhattan is often shown oriented vertically on maps, which gives the impression that it runs north and south, it's actually tilted off axis from due north by about 29 degrees. Now that we've got our bearings, let's journey northeast into the park, back in time to the formation of the island of Manhattan itself. Behind me is Glen Span Arch, near the northern end of the park, at 103rd Street. The stones that make up this arch are actually carved from the bedrock of Manhattan. Although most of the boulders in Central Park are Manhattan schist, which is around 450 million years old, Glenspan Arch is made from a type of stone called Fordham gneiss, which formed here over 1 billion years ago. These stones were shaped by hand with hammer and chisel into traditional voussoirs, or wedge-shaped blocks that make up an arch. When you pass through this arch, built from stones that are over 1 billion years old, you feel as though you were crossing a portal into an entirely different world. Back to a time before Manhattan was transformed into a gleaming metropolis of brick, steel, and glass. It's a perfect introduction to the north end of the park, which feels the most naturalistic and the most removed from the bustle and hustle of Midtown Manhattan. Here you'll find the most picturesque waterfalls in the park. As you might know from our other video on Central Park, nearly all of its lakes and streams are fed by pipes, carrying drinking water. But here, passing under the arch, is where you'll find the only natural water source that still exists in Central Park. It's called Montaigne's Rivulet, and it starts at a body of water called the Pool. It was named after a physician who owned most of the land in this area in the early 1600s, when New York was still New Amsterdam. This natural stream is mostly underground now, after much of Manhattan was infilled with earth to create more buildable lots. Montaigne's Rivulet originally flowed all the way to the East River, but today only this small portion remains. Also underneath this arch is what's known as the grotto. A grotto is a small artificial cave made to look natural, often with or near a water feature. This obelisk towering over my shoulder is much older than Central Park. In fact, it was carved about 3,500 years ago and more than 5,000 miles away in Heliopolis, Egypt. So how did it get here? This 220-ton artifact carved from a single piece of granite was actually a gift. It was given to the United States by Egypt in the 1870s as a diplomatic gesture. But this wasn't the first time the obelisk had been moved. Although it is called Cleopatra's Needle, it wasn't actually commissioned by Cleopatra. It was originally created for Pharaoh Thutmose III for the Temple of the Sun near modern-day Cairo. 2,000 years later, while under Roman rule, the temple was rediscovered as ruins, and the obelisk and its twin had been toppled over and partially buried in the sand. The Romans dug it up and moved it to Alexandria on the north coast of Egypt to a new temple that was created by Cleopatra, hence the name Cleopatra's Needle. In fact, you could still see evidence from its Roman journey. The bronze crabs that support the obelisk at the base were forged by the Romans as a way to help it balance when they installed it at Cleopatra's temple. The crabs supporting this obelisk are actually replicas, but you could still see the originals on display in the museum. When this monument was moved to New York City, it took some serious engineering to get it across the Atlantic Ocean intact. And the Roebling Company, who had designed and built the Brooklyn Bridge, took on the job. After it arrived in Manhattan, a special temporary railroad was built to move it from the banks of the Hudson River to its current location in Central Park. The train trip took 35 days to cover just a few miles, in part because of a blizzard that briefly shut down the operation. Although there's nothing else like it in Central Park, or in the United States for that matter, it was actually part of a matching set. The other one was gifted to the United Kingdom and stands on the banks of the River Thames in London, where they decided to leave it instead of spending more money to bring it inland. Over my shoulder is what's known as the Blockhouse, although it's not actually a house, but a fort built for the War of 1812. It was built in a hurry because they thought the British were going to attack again, but that never happened, and this fort was completed just 2 days before the war ended in 1814. So because it was built in such a hurry, and it was built by different groups, the stones don't match, and each group essentially brought their own building materials with them, which gives it this sort of motley hodgepodge feel. It's one of the oldest surviving buildings in Manhattan, and the oldest in the park. And if you like the look of it, you have Vaux and Olmsted to thank. They preserved it effectively as an architectural folly, which is a small ruin or rustic structure, and it serves no purpose other than to give a sense of history. Because this is one of the highest points in Manhattan, it was strategically important. And along the ridge, there was a line of other forts like this one, including Fort Clinton, Nutter's Battery, and Fort Fish. This building over my shoulder is known as the Arsenal. Millard Fillmore, who would later become President of the United States, oversaw the construction of this building as a place to store arms for the New York State Militia. But that didn't last long. The state of New York seized the land underneath it for the new Central Park. And since then, the Arsenal has had many different uses. It was once the original home of the Museum of Natural History, where paleontologists reconstructed dinosaur skeletons in a studio on the upper floor. It also served as an art gallery until that moved to another location uptown. And it was also the original weather station in the park until that also moved to Belvedere Castle. Today, the Arsenal serves a civic rather than a militaristic function. It is now the headquarters of the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, the Arsenal Gallery, the City Parks Foundation, the Historic House Trust, and the New York Wildlife Conservation Society. And the grounds around it are used as the Tisch Children's Zoo. There are still some clues of this building's military origins, one of which are the murals in the main lobby. These murals were created by artist Alan Solberg for the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. Another hint that this was a military facility is the architecture itself. With its castle-like crenellations, it is very reminiscent of other military buildings in New York from the time period, including the Armory on the Upper East Side. Another feature is the eagle and the stacked cannonballs above the main entranceway. The architect of this building, Martin Thompson, also designed a famous bank in the early 1800s, whose facade is now on display inside the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which sits on Central Park land. Where we're standing is what's known as McGowan's Pass. We've already traveled an ancient waterway and an ancestral native path. Now let's take a walk on a road that was truly revolutionary. In the 17th and 18th century, Boston Post Road was the main artery of Manhattan. It ran all the way from the southern tip of the island north to Boston. And it got its name because it was the official route for the Postal Service, hence the term post. Here at the northern end of Central Park, Boston Post Road passed through a narrow ravine, which made it a very important location during the Revolutionary War. Paul Revere even carried a letter from Samuel Adams to bring news of the Boston Tea Party along this road. A few years later, the British stormed Manhattan in 1776, seemingly overpowering the Revolutionary soldiers and causing Washington to question whether they had lost the war. But as the British marched north towards Washington's headquarters at the Morris Jamel Mansion, which we covered in a previous video on Manhattan mansions, it was right here at McGowan's Pass that Washington's troops stopped the British advance and turned the tide of the war once again. 7 years later, in 1784, the occupying British troops left the island of Manhattan on what is remembered as Evacuation Day, and George Washington led a victory march down Boston Post Road in celebration. McGowan's Pass is a great example of the preserved history in the park. But of course, many of the buildings and settlements on what would become park land did not survive. Like the free black settlement of Seneca Village, an infamous example of eminent domain where an entire landowning community was forcibly displaced. Near the site was another community that predated the park, a convent known as Mount St. Vincent's, which was established in 1847 by the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. When the park was commissioned, their land too was claimed by eminent domain, and they moved to the Bronx. While the designers of the park, Vaux and Olmsted, used the convent as their headquarters during construction. It was also used as a hospital during the Civil War. And it was the sisters who had been displaced that came back to serve as nurses to the injured soldiers. Today, only a few foundations and a stone marker memorialize the fact that the convent was ever here. Central Park was designed with many small entrances, as opposed to one singular grand entrance. This was meant to highlight the fact that the park was built for all the people of New York. An inclusive democratic space to be enjoyed by everybody, from politicians and bankers to factory workers and fishermen. And each of the original 20 entrances to the park were designated with a name honoring occupations or roles in society. This celebration of New Yorkers also included direct reference to the diversity of cultures and national origins of people in the city, with the Strangers Gate at 106th Street making explicit reference to immigrants, which have always been a boon to the culture and industry of the city. The park's designers and commissioners considered naming the gates after other things, like military figures or diplomatic leaders. But ultimately, the decision to honor everyday people was a philosophical statement by Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a passionate abolitionist. In his view, naming the gates after everyday people of all backgrounds and occupations would highlight the free labor economy of the North, in direct contrast to the enslaved workers of the Confederate South. In fact, in 1863, at the height of the Civil War, Vaux and Olmsted even resigned in protest when the commissioners of the park tried to bring in Richard Morris Hunt, the famous architect, to create a grand gated entrance plaza to the park, a far cry from their egalitarian vision. But it was never built. Although this standoff happened in the mid-1800s, the names of many of these gates wouldn't actually be carved into the stone until the year 2000, when the Central Park Conservancy finally put into action the original vision of the park's designers. In the end, though, Richard Morris Hunt did get to build his entrance gate, sort of. Calvert Vaux designed the original building for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which sits within the park. But Richard Morris Hunt was later hired to build an addition to it. And when he did, his building completely blocked the view of Vaux's from Fifth Avenue and also included a grand entrance built in a European style. So now when you enter the Met, in a sense, you're entering the park the way Richard Morris Hunt originally wanted you to. That's just a small slice of the history that you can reach out and touch inside of Central Park. Let us know what other places you'd like to learn about in the comments below.
These two towers could be thought of as the birthplace of the penthouse apartment in Manhattan and possibly the world. I'm Nick Potts, I'm an architect, and today we're going to be doing a walking tour of Manhattan's Upper West Side. Something that was happening almost uniquely here on the Upper West Side. At the turn of the century, it was becoming a neighborhood where people coming from other places who were on the make were looking for places to live. And the apartment hotel really was the solution for this. These apartments didn't have kitchens, and so they looked like an apartment. People would live in them for a long time, but anything dealing with service was centralized. You never had to cross paths with staff. We're in the 20th century here. There's electricity on the street, there are subways, so it's starting to get a little bit more buzzing, and the hubbub of Broadway was becoming an appeal. The big idea of these apartment hotels to attract the upwardly mobile middle class was a thing that was happening here on the Upper West Side uniquely. And buildings like this were starting to pop up as kind of this new nexus of an apartment hotel neighborhood. Right now we're in front of the Dakota. This is really one of the first buildings on the Upper West Side. The name, the Dakota, was a bit of a joke because it was so remote, both so far west and so far north, that it may as well be in the Dakotas, which weren't even states yet. And the building is fairly experimental in terms of its location and also its technology. A building of this height needed elevators. And to have elevators, you have to have electricity, which didn't exist here on the Upper West Side until the subways were run in 1900. It was the heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune who developed this building. He provided his own power plant and really embarked on an almost experimental folly. The Dakota really was the pioneer of making apartment living for the upwardly mobile middle class acceptable and something that would attract more residents and ultimately more buildings. And this was a middle class building. And the middle class that existed in the 1880s when this was built was very different than what we have now. People had staffs. People were expected to have like a certain level of wealth to buy into this. At the same time, again, this is apartment living is new, and the idea of living next to someone rather than having your own individual house and having to cross paths with their staff was still something that a lot of people were trying to get behind. So in a building like the Dakota, there was a huge amount of planning put into the separation of front of house and back of house. So underneath the courtyard of the Dakota, there's an entire level of service. And so the servants using the area beneath the courtyard would essentially never have to cross paths with the building's residents. One of the most interesting things about the Dakota is that there are no corridors. There are these 4 separate passenger towers that led to these enormous apartments that essentially bridged an entire corner of the building before they went to the service towers that were in the center. So at the time the Dakota was under construction, apartment building design was still very modular, where people were taking, as many rooms as they needed, where it was a suite of 3 salons or something with an entire residence. And that was really appealing to people who were trying to establish themselves. If you think about the movie Rosemary's Baby, that this obviously starred prominently in, the crux of the situation with the homeowners is that it's a combined apartment with a shared closet. Stylistically, the Dakota is also a pioneer or an outlier in many ways. It was designed by Henry Hardenberg, who eventually designed the Plaza Hotel in 1907. It's pretty unique in that it's a Germanic medieval style building. It almost looks like a civic building that you would see go up in the middle of Europe in the 1850s or 1860s, like a post office or a city hall. So there's a monumentality to it. And the building even has a moat if you look around it, which wasn't meant to be like a castle. It was meant to bring light in, but it continues the theme of this fortress-like Northern European medieval sort of architecture. This odd Germanic style really wasn't adopted elsewhere in the Upper West Side, but the planning of the Dakota became a really important pattern. And you look at buildings like the Apthorpe and the Belnor that have a very similar sort of planning, no corridors, separate elevator towers, the central courtyard. You see the pattern of the Dakota really taking root uniquely in the Upper West Side. And as other developments happened, particularly a few blocks further west on Broadway, they mimicked the sorts of amenity spaces that the Dakota had, while in a more approachable sort of building, the apartment hotel. This building behind me is the Hotel Belclair, which is important for two major reasons. The first is that it was the first major commission by Emery Roth, who was the architect of the San Remo, the El Dorado, the Beresford, really the most iconic buildings on Central Park West. It's also important because it's emblematic of a new building type, which is the apartment hotel. And this is a type that emerged really here on the Upper West Side to suit the needs of an on-the-make upper middle class. So because in this time period, the mixing of residents and staff was a really important deal, a lot of the planning of these buildings was around the separation of service and living. And there's always a service elevator. The functions like the kitchens and the servants' rooms and quarters are always centered towards the center of the building, usually around a light court to kind of stay away from the salons and the kind of the high value spaces which are lining the public face of the building. And a building like this, though it served the needs of the upper middle class, it really wasn't something that people on the east side looked well upon, where the old money lived in their kind of proper limestone or brownstone buildings with kind of restrained ornament. A building like this appealed to the West Side taste. You know, these are people who are on the make. The excess was appealing to them and not considered garish or in poor taste. This building is really a unique example in New York of the Viennese Secession / Art Nouveau style. You see a lot more of this experimentation on the West Side because this is targeted to people who are on the make and they're looking to impress. And the more ornament, the more stuff added to it, it appeals to people who are kind of looking to make their way up. So this building was going up at exactly the same time as two other major apartment hotels along Broadway, a few blocks further south, the Ansonia, which is the largest and probably the most iconic of these, and the Doralton, which is similar in terms of scale and form to what you see on the Belclair, but taller and a little more French in planning. But the idea is the same. It's a corner buildings targeted towards an apartment hotel that was meant to attract people who were moving to the city and establishing themselves. Behind me is the Ansonia, and this was built in 1904. The reason why there's a proliferation of these large apartment buildings here at 72nd Street and Broadway is right underneath it. And you can see the 72nd Street IRT subway station. This was right around the same time, around 1901, 1902. And because of this, there's electrification and the means of people to get from further downtown up here. So the land value skyrocketed and it was natural to build a large building. So this is another apartment hotel. It's the largest of any of these. There were 300 suites when this was built. Stylistically, it's French Beaux-Arts. Stokes, who was the developer of the Ansonia, hired an architect from Paris, Paul Dubois, to design essentially a Haussmannian building. This is very similar to what you see in the 8th arrondissement in Paris with the French balconies and the band courses, but it's blown up to an enormous scale, almost 3 times what you would see in Paris, where the buildings are 5-6 stories. He was also so involved that the architect ended up just leaving the country. He paid him off to go back to France, and Stokes essentially took over the building as his folly and kind of lavished money on it. There were Turkish baths, there were shopping arcades. Really, you know, it was an apartment hotel, but it had all of what you'd expect in a 5-star hotel now. The building failed really quickly after it was built. It built in 1904. By the time the 1930s came around, the kitchens were already closed. So it went through a really rapid change in the types of people that it housed. It declined significantly during the 1970s, and it really became in the 1970s almost a flop house in poor repair. But because it was very well built, again, this was Stokes' folly. He poured a lot of money into it, which ultimately bankrupted the building. It's very robustly built. The steel is heavily fireproof with stone. The floors are actually 2 layers thick, and so it's essentially soundproof. So this actually made it a great place for musicians to live. Again, we're just up the 2-3 line from Times Square, close to Lincoln Center when that came about. So this became a great place for musicians to live and actually live work, so they could teach classes or practice in their apartment without really bothering the neighbors. It's just really amazing to think about the number of people who are noted in terms of music and performing arts Rachmaninoff, Mahler, Stravinsky, Florence Ziegfeld, who have lived and worked just in that one building. The Turkish baths that were in the basement of the building when it was first built obviously didn't have a use anymore. So by the time the 1970s came around, it was a gay bathhouse called the Continental Baths where Bette Midler got her start. And you can just think about its importance in establishing New York and maintaining its cachet as a cultural capital. In terms of its planning, the Ansonia is a departure from earlier apartment buildings such as the Dakota, where the vertical circulation was split up in multiple cores. Here, the Ansonia actually centralizes all the elevators into one stacked core, which is the way that a lot of hotels and office towers and even residential towers are planned now. So there's a bit more forward thinking in terms of centralizing the circulation into one spine versus dispersing it into small neighborhoods. The Upper West Side was really the last place in Manhattan where townhouses were built. And what you can see is that they're extremely eclectic, containing everything from Moorish decoration, classical sculpture, and more modish sorts of arts and crafts motifs. So really interesting and individual as opposed to what you see on the East Side. So these two towers behind me, you could think of as being the birthplace of the penthouse in New York City and possibly even the world. It's the San Remo, this is 1930, it's Emery Roth, so barely 30 years after the construction of the Hotel Belclair. You can see the drastic changes in both the adoption of apartment living as a proper place where people live, and also architecturally the development of the apartment house into its own distinct style. The idea of the penthouse is really something that was birthed in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. When tall buildings were first thought about, the top of the building was seen as a place for equipment. This building really comes right off the heels of an earlier Emery Roth building, the Beresford, just north of the American Natural History Museum. And that building was the first to introduce towers. In the case of the Beresford, the towers were not for people to live in, they were actually for equipment. So it was the water tanks and the overruns for the elevators took up the prominent towers. What happened between the Beresford and San Remo, however, was the multiple dwelling law of 1929. And that was a state-mandated law that talked about essentially how to build an apartment tower. This law that said if you have a 100-foot-long block, the towers can be yay big and they have to be this far apart. Previously, buildings were less valuable as you got higher and higher up, but the elevator made that whole getting vertical much more seamless. And as people started realizing views, that whole idea flipped and the higher floors suddenly became more valuable because you have this added bonus and this added value of views that really hadn't been quantified before. So the towers on the San Remo are really the pinnacle of this development of a new style and type of building, which is the apartment tower.
Everybody knows about the Gilded Age mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York City. But what came before them? And how have New York City mansions evolved since they fell out of fashion? I'm Michael Weitzner. I've been an architect in New York City for over 35 years. And today, we're going to be doing a walking tour of 250 years of Manhattan mansions. So before European colonizers arrived here in the 1500s, the Lenape tribe called this island home for 12,000 years. And they named it Manhattan, which means hilly island. And that's exactly what it is. Where we're standing now is called Coogan's Bluff, one of the highest elevations in Manhattan. The views here were fantastic before tall buildings were common, and they're still pretty great. And that's why some of the wealthiest early European settlers chose to build their homes right here, including some people you might have heard of, like Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Not only rivals, but neighbors, as it turns out. This Belgian block street we're walking on is Sylvan Terrace. And these actually are the original wooden townhouses built in 1882. As we walk along this street, we're walking back in time 260 years to the oldest existing mansion in Manhattan. This is the Morris Jumel Mansion. This house was built for Roger Morris, a colonel in the British Army in 1765. It was built as his country estate, and it was actually 11 miles north of New York City, which at the time ended at Wall Street. Stylistically, it's a Greek Revival building. And one of the most interesting things about it is that it appears to be made out of stone, but it's actually made out of wood. Some of the elements clearly mimicking stone are the coins at the corners, the Doric columns, the pediment, and the water line. Quoins are large stones used to reinforce the corners in masonry buildings. But these are built out of wood and are purely decorative. What they were trying to achieve here in wood was an imitation of the architectural expression of wealth back in Europe, which would have been made in stone. And those buildings were referencing ancient Greek architecture to project longevity and transgenerational wealth. But ironically, those ancient Greek buildings, which have lasted thousands of years because they were made of stone, were actually imitating wood buildings in the first place. In fact, ancient Greek architecture has been called a carpentry in marble. So this is a wood building imitating a stone building, which were originally imitating wood buildings. So above the columns on a Greek temple, you would typically see what's called a triglyph. Those are actually imitations of the ends of wood rafters and joists, which were used in earlier wooden temples to support the roof. So this building is also interesting historically. It was actually George Washington's headquarters during the Battle of Harlem Heights in the Revolutionary War. Strategically, this was an ideal location because it's the second highest point in Manhattan, and you could actually get a view from river to river. It would be purchased years later by a French wine merchant named Jumel in 1810. And soon after his death, his widow Eliza would marry Aaron Burr right here in the parlor of this house. And Aaron Burr, coincidentally, killed the owner of the next mansion we're going to look at. Behind me is the Grange, built for Alexander Hamilton in 1802. Sadly, he would only live here for 2 years before he was tragically killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. It was built in the Federalist style by John McComb, who also designed the lighthouse at Montauk Point, Gracie Mansion, where the mayor of New York still lives while in office, and New York City Hall. The Federalist style is interesting because it sort of became the unofficial style of the early United States. The Federalist style is sort of a stripped-down version of the Georgian style, which was developed by Robert Adams in England. Georgian buildings also imitated classical architecture. The Georgian style was, of course, named for all the kings named George, and so the fact that the Federalist style diverges from that has a nice parallel to the history of the United States. This is also a wood building, but an honest expression of wood, not imitating stone. And you can also see the form of the townhouse starting to emerge here, with the very rectilinear shape, the appearance of a flat roof, a deep stairway or stoop, and even these protruding octagonal bays that are somewhat hidden under these deep porches, like you might see on a residential Brooklyn street. There are some interesting things going on with the roof as well, which appears flat, but it's actually a sort of shallow version of a mansard roof. There are 4 chimneys, 2 of which are actually fake, placed there just for symmetry's sake. This is not its original location. In fact, it's its 3rd location, having moved twice. Originally, this building was built on a 32-acre estate, just 1 mile south of the Morris Jumel Mansion, and had to be moved when the city grid of 1811 expanded northward. And like the Morris Jumel Mansion, this was built on a high bluff, which afforded it these beautiful views all the way out to Long Island Sound. Over my shoulder, you can see the Bailey Mansion. This was built for the Bailey half of the famous Barnum and Bailey circus, James Bailey. It has an engraving on the side of the year 1887, but it was actually completed a year late in 1888. It was designed by the architect Samuel B. Reed, and it's considered Romanesque revival, but really it's an amalgamation of a number of different styles. It has these Romanesque arches, a Gothic spire, a Flemish gable, a French chateau-style turret, a Victorian roof replete with widow's walk, medieval crenellations, and a bay window with a Renaissance-style pediment. And the end result is a magnificent mansion in limestone that somehow really works. Inside, the house is possibly even more impressive. Remember, this is 1888, but inside there was steam heat, electric and gas lights, and unlike the first 2 homes we saw, it was built with indoor plumbing. Louis Comfort Tiffany's cousin, Joseph Burr Tiffany, designed the interiors, which are incredibly ornate, with extremely intricate woodwork in the screens and an ingle nook by the fireplace. It has stained glass windows by Henry Belcher, who was an inventor that actually held 2 patents for different types of glass. This house was built in the Gilded Age, but instead of being down on Fifth Avenue, it was built out here in the suburbs of Manhattan. When James Bailey moved here, he thought this would become the next fashionable neighborhood in Manhattan. But that never materialized, and just over a decade later, he moved north to Mount Vernon in Westchester County. But the next great neighborhood wasn't further north, it was actually further south. So far, we've seen 2 Manhattan country estates and a Gilded Age mansion on a suburban Manhattan block. But now let's jump into this 20th century and the beginnings of a whole new kind of mansion right in the heart of the city. Over my shoulder is what's known simply as the Kramer House. This was only the second modernist building ever built on the entire island of Manhattan. It was designed by William Lescaze in 1935. And actually, the first modernist building in Manhattan was his own house, to which this bears a striking resemblance. So the Kramers had seen his house, and they asked him to build one just like it. So what is a modernist building? Well, it doesn't mean new, and it doesn't mean contemporary. It refers to a movement that began in the 1910s, also known as the International style. In architecture, modernism is a rejection of historical ornament like you would see in a Greek revival. At the time the modernist movement began, Beaux-Arts was the prevailing aesthetic, which you would see in banks, museums, and office buildings. And the Beaux-Arts was very classical, very ornamented. Modernism, by contrast, was about simplified forms and abstraction. It prioritized functionality and hygiene, more light, more air, a rejection of the dark spaces in slums and tenements. And one of the giants of modernism was Le Corbusier. He was a Swiss-born French architect, painter, and writer. And he outlined 5 main points of modernism. And this house really showcases all 5 of those points. The first thing you can see is that the building is built up on pilotis, which is Le Corbusier's term for slender columns. In this case, the party walls act as those pilotis. And in between those pilotis, you can see an example of the free plan with the curving entrance, where they took the main entrance and they tucked it back in the site. The neighbors' houses, as you can see, have stairs leading up to the entrance, but here, the stairs were put on the inside. With the free facade, the windows can be placed wherever they are needed. And in this case, you can see he did these big horizontal ribbon windows above on the building, which allow a lot of natural light to come in, compared to the buildings to the side, which have these small punched windows. And of course, you can see it has a flat roof. Of course, most townhouses do have a flat roof with just a tiny slope for rain to run off. But in this case, it also satisfies the intention of modernism to create a livable space on top of the building. And the other really modernist thing about this building is its materials. You could see the steel-framed windows, glass block, curved enameled metal panels, and stucco. So before, where we looked at these freestanding houses, now we're looking at a house that's part of the fabric of the city. It's part of the street wall, and it shares walls with its neighbors. While it's rejecting the historicism of the past, it still embraces the city around it. It's not a radical departure in terms of the way people lived, because wealthy people had been living in townhouses for years. But it was a radical departure in the way wealth was expressed. It embraced new ideas, new materials, and new technology. So rather than trying to blend in with old money, this house chose to stand out. Behind me, you can see 23 Beekman Place, designed by Paul Rudolph. Paul Rudolph was one of the great practitioners of brutalist architecture. He did the Tracy Towers in the Bronx, the Endo Laboratories in Garden City on Long Island, and the Yale Art and Architecture Building. This building takes standing out to a whole other level. It was described as one of the most amazing pieces of urban, modern, domestic architecture in the entire country, according to Michael Sorkin, the great architect and critic in House and Garden in 1981. Paul Rudolph himself said it was worth taking risks to create architecture that provoked strong reactions. In a way, he was trying to redefine space by maximizing natural light and openness. He made this penthouse extension on the roof, made of precast concrete panels, steel and glass. And he created wonderful outdoor spaces and rooftop gardens as part of that. It takes free plan to a whole other level. There are very few interior walls. Instead, it's a series of balconies, one looking over the other. There are actually 27 different floor levels in the penthouse triplex. And he also used mirror finishes and transparent materials throughout to break down how the space is defined and further enhance the visual aesthetic of openness and natural light. So it makes it harder to discern the limits of the space, where one room begins and the other one ends, almost giving it a feeling of endlessness. He created this amazing mansion in the sky, but he actually had renters on the lower floors of the building. And this really is a unique and beautiful expression of penthouse living in New York City, which is maybe why Sorkin called him the best designer of his generation. Behind me is the Spire Mansion at 176 East 72nd Street. And this was a mansion that was built at the end of the 20th century. From what I understand, the site was chosen because 2 brownstones became available and now they had a double-wide lot to build on. Typically in a row house, light is an issue because you have buildings on either side. You can only get light in the front or the back. But in this case, because they have a double-wide lot, there's opportunities for a lot more glass to bring in a lot more natural light. But it appears the architects decided it might be too much light and added this expansive limestone for privacy. And actually what I find most interesting about this building is its use of materials, in that it references the modernist movement with this metal and glass, but also harkens back to more classical architecture in its use of limestone. So the metal and glass facade is very reminiscent of a Mies van der Rohe design. But on closer inspection, you see that it's not a regular grid like Mies favored, but in fact more closely resembles the composition of a Mondrian painting, which is fitting because the owners of this home are actually known art enthusiasts. And the limestone harkens back to both classical architecture and the city itself. Along with brick, limestone was really the traditional building material of New York. So by adding this limestone piece, it gives it a sense of history and also a sense of warmth that feels more domestic, but in an elevated way that lets you know a rich person lives here. And even though it is this traditional material, the combination of this punched window in this slot shape is very referential to Le Corbusier. One last note about this building that I really like is this north-facing skylight at the top, which was typically used for artist brownstones throughout the city. And I feel like it's a signal that lets you know that an art enthusiast lives here. So at the end of the 20th century, with the buildings we've just looked at, you can see an evolution. So we started out with country houses north of the city, and then they became more woven into the fabric of the city and the street wall. These are just a small sample of the homes of wealthy New Yorkers, past and present. If you'd like to see more New York City mansions, let us know in the comments below.
My name's Nick Potts. I'm an architect. Today we're on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and we're going to be doing an architectural walking tour of the neighborhood. So Manhattan's development was really a continual march upward up until we got to this point where we are now. The wealthy originally lived down towards the Battery around Bowling Green. In the 1830s, they moved further uptown to around Washington Square Park. Before the 1890s, they were all centered south of Central Park South. So it really wasn't until 1895 when Caroline Astor moved to 65th and 5th Avenue that it became acceptable for the old moneyed New York classes to live this far uptown. We are at the corner of East 79th Street and 5th Avenue. The building behind us, which is currently the Ukrainian Institute, is the centerpiece of what was known as the Cook Block. When the Upper East Side became acceptable for people to live as far uptown as we currently are, there was a bit of a land rush where people started buying and developing parcels of land for the next big round of where the upper class will live. And the Cook Block is really kind of the most perfectly intact example of this and what a lot of the Upper East Side was, which is single family houses that were developed and built as residences for their owners as they were moving further and further uptown. And you can see it's a very eclectic group of styles. The Ukrainian Institute is a French chateau-esque building. Architect was C.P.H. Gilbert, who did a lot of these kind of revivalist style buildings, both here and in Brooklyn, really taking a lot of particularly French Gothic influences, almost like the Chateau of the Loire Valley, brought down and shrunk and put on a street corner. A lot of the elements of this building, like the spires, the carvings, they're really drawing from French medieval and religious or ecclesiastical architecture, but translating them into a residential building form. The rest of this block has other examples of Jacobean style, Beaux-Arts, so it's really the greatest hits of what people were building for upper class residences at the turn of the 19th century. Right now we're in from 998 5th Avenue. So this is really one of the most important communal apartment buildings that remade the Upper East Side. When this was developed, it was around 1910. An apartment building of this scale really hadn't been taken up. It was rental, which may look interesting because it's a very large, very grand building, but the whole notion of someone owning a house in an apartment building was kind of not done. And this was a first experiment with A, attracting upper class buyers, and B, getting homeowners and urban dwellers to buy off on the idea of living in a communal building as opposed to a single family house. The architects of this, McKimby and White, were kind of the masters of reusing historic forms. It's essentially a giant Renaissance plaza stretched up to gargantuan scale. And you can see in order to calm the scale of taking something that was originally much smaller and blowing it up to 3 times its size, they combined elements. The base of the building with this really kind of great pulvinated, which are the rounded edge, almost pillow-like rustication of the stones. It's 3 stories tall as opposed to 1. Things that would be cornices are turned into entire floors, such as the cartouche level and the level with the marble band, and then the top, which would be a cornice level. So they're kind of smartly taking the elements of a much smaller building and turning them into entire floors to help calm and balance the composition of the building's form. Now, inside of this building, it's actually quite interesting because the apartments themselves they're really mansions in the sky. If you think about arranging the scale of a house in a rectangle with multi-floor apartments and kind of these sprawling layouts that you expect in a mansion, it's kind of almost like a work of Jenga trying to fit the pieces together. And McKimmey & White masterfully did that. You don't even notice if there's a double height or duplex apartment. Everything looks very even. It's a very kind of calm and proper arrangement of many apartments in one ultimately very simple rectangle. This actually predates the large additions to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So McKimmey & White did this in 1910, and their late additions to the Met Museum in kind of the left and right wings were actually after this. So this was the pioneer, and the museum kind of grew up around it. So right now we're outside of the Metropolitan Museum of Art on 5th Avenue. We look at the building, we kind of see this grand Beaux-Arts facade, but actually within the building, way buried inside of it, is a much smaller, more high Victorian Gothic building that slowly grew over the years as the museum grew and grew. The facade, as we see it now, is also concealing a few secrets. It's actually an unfinished building. If you look at the top of the columns, you'll see those big awkward blocks, which were meant to be sculptural groups. No one really knows what the sculpture is going to be, which makes it even more intriguing. It's also showing a bit of the problematic nature of preservation, and particularly in a stone building, gravity really doesn't like stone. And as things deteriorate, particularly a limestone building like this that can't really survive a lot of freeze-thaw cycles, you end up having to put netting as we're waiting for buildings to be restored. It's interesting to think that the same architects who are working on this we're working on the same apartment buildings that we've been looking at throughout the neighborhood. So these architects, as the profession is growing, people really didn't specialize in being a museum architect or an apartment architect. You were really just an architect and taking on a bunch of different typologies. Right now, we are on Park Avenue near 67th Street in front of the Park Avenue Armory. So the Park Avenue Armory is a survivor from the pre-electrification of the Park Avenue rail line. It's essentially a military building where the 7th Regiment, who was primarily made up of people who lived in the neighborhood, it was nicknamed the Silk Stocking Regiment. So it was, people who had served in the military who were from slightly fancier backgrounds. It's kind of a high Victorian Gothic fantasy on a castle. It's a little bit of polychrome. It is missing its central tower. Originally had a much taller tower in the center, which didn't survive. What's most notable about the building, however, is its interiors. Because this was the neighborhood Louis Comfort Tiffany and some very well-heeled veterans, their meeting rooms are incredibly opulent. And these continue to this day. If you go there for an event, there are these very ornate club rooms for the people who use the building, in addition to the massive drill hall, which is still used. The language of the building really proclaims its military use. Particularly if you look at the top of the building, there are these corbels that kind of poke out. It almost looks like the rampart on the top of a castle. And if you look at the bottom of the building, it's the same sort of fortified, do not mess with me sort of language. The walls get wider and thicker. There's almost a perceived moat around it. So it really doesn't project a whole lot of welcomeness. It projects solidity and strength. Just like Park Avenue went from being a rail yard to this upscale residential corridor, this building has gone from being something really about the military to an art center. We're on the corner of 76th and Madison outside of the Carlisle Hotel. So the Carlisle is really important to the Upper East Side. It's really the social heart of this neighborhood. It's also a really interesting moment in the acceptance of a hotel as an acceptable living environment. And this building, it may operate as a hotel, but it's a combination of long-term co-op living and hotel rooms. So for someone who doesn't want to buy into an apartment, this sort of building, when it was built in 1930, was exactly what they were looking for. In terms of its built form, this building is also really fascinating in that it's almost perfect encapsulation of what happened after the 1916 zoning code, which reshaped what a New York skyscraper is. Following 1916, there was a need for setbacks to preserve the light and air on the streets surrounding tall buildings. And you see that with the Carlisle. There's a limited street wall, and the building cascades and steps further and further and back from the sidewalk as it gets taller. Because it was built in 1930, it's also a really great example of Art Deco streamlined style, which is kind of a perfect stylistic move for a setback tower like this. And the detailing, kind of the hallmarks of Art Deco style, you can see in the parapets. There's chevrons, there's very abstract, modern, optimistic, high-tech shapes. You see it in the simplified form, the use of materials such as aluminum. It's really kind of taking advantage of technology and creating something that is really wholly modern for this new modern tall building type. So now we're outside of the Duke Mansion on the corner of East 78th Street and 5th Avenue. The Duke Mansion is a Louis XV kind of severely neoclassical house. It actually replaced the Victorian house that had existed here for only 26 years. So the people who built this, the Dukes, were really trying to make a statement. And the statement they decided to make was one of relevance. And by taking this royal style, this is the Petit Trianon brought to 5th Avenue, they're really trying to legitimize themselves and their wealth, which maybe wasn't as old money or as rooted as some of their neighbor. This is really a house that was designed for entertaining. If you watch The Gilded Age, this house is essentially the Russell's house. It's a place to make a statement, to show that you've arrived in New York and New York society. And what other way to do that than to build essentially a royal palace? One of the major motifs of a palace of this style, which this is aspiring to be, is a bel étage, which is a room for entertaining. Usually if you're in France, it's up a level because the street is for animals, it's for business. Because here we don't have that. It's slightly lower and it's a residential neighborhood, and so the entertaining floor is brought a little bit low. And one of the nice things that happens here is that you can actually see into the rooms. You can see the gilding on the ceilings in the ballrooms. So there's a little bit of kind of public display by lowering that and putting a little bit of the interior wealth on display, almost like a jewel box. The scale of this building is really almost civic. If you think about it as a public building or a public display of wealth, it kind of makes sense. This Louis XV style, as opposed to some of the more flamboyant Gothic and Revival styles on the block, it's very restrained, it's very severe. The ornament is actually quite minimal. There are some garlands, there are some panels, but as opposed to huge sculptural groups and large band courses, it's actually quite plain. The limestone is kind of plainly dressed. There's not a lot of rustication. In that restraint, there's a little bit of a game being played. The scale of the building is quite ostentatious, but the building is making the show as opposed to the elements decorating it. We are on the corner of 75th and Madison, outside of what used to be the Whitney Museum of American Art. This building has several interesting stories behind it. The first, if we look purely in terms of style, it's a bit out of place for what we've been seeing in the Upper East Side. It's a brutalist building. It's very aggressive in its form. It steps out over the sidewalk. It has very blank faces towards the street, and that was intentional. This is a building that was designed to stand out and to be something totally different than its surrounding environment. And if you think about the townhouses and the hotels and the former mansions of the Upper East Side, this is something totally other, and it's befitting of a modern museum building that is meant to exhibit art. The museum is really a work of art in and of itself. It's a sculptural building, but it's not totally without context. Most brutalist buildings of the period, this is the late 1960s, were made of concrete, and here it's clad in stone, a warmer, more natural material that is responsive to the context and the materiality of the buildings in the Upper East Side. In terms of its form, it may look very aggressive and out of scale, but if you see the cornice line of the houses to the south is more or less carried over. So there's a little bit of a play and a subversion of the scale of the neighborhood and its surrounding buildings. It's definitely trying to stand out, but it's doing so by responding to and rejecting the rules of the game of the neighborhood that surrounds it. It's also responding to its interior layout and its use, which is something that in a lot of the apartment buildings you don't really see. You're using the facades are concealing the complicated nature of the interior plan. Here in the Whitney Galleries, you can see the 3 floors of galleries, each expressing itself as a volume as it faces the street. And the windows give little glimpses. Art doesn't really like direct light, so it's doing it in a very minimal way that makes the interaction of the public in the interiority of the galleries and in the neighborhood kind of availed and framed one. The Whitney, as it was built here in 1968, almost became a victim of its own success. It was so popular that it needed to expand, and the building being so sculptural and also in an historic district made that actually impossible. There are a lot of proposals thrown around, but including expanding where the townhouses to the right are, but simply it couldn't be done, and they ended up moving off site. And one of the ironies of the building being a victim of its historic district is that it itself is now considered an historic building and really can't be modified. What we have here is the triumph of preservation over everything else. Right now we are in front of 740 Park Avenue, probably the most well-known of any of the Upper East Side co-op buildings. What makes it really interesting, it exists on land that was originally not very well thought of. Park Avenue, up until 1910, was a railroad yard. It was, coal-fired trains in a trench belching out fuel, and a lot of the houses around here were tenements. After the rail lines were electrified in 1910, the neighborhood was marketed as something totally other, and rather than a kind of downtrodden railroad yard, it was renamed Park Avenue and became a place where the ultra wealthy would start building these apartment houses, such as this one. It was designed by Rosario Candela, who was the kind of great co-op apartment building master. And his mastery was both in terms of planning and fitting these very complicated, sprawling, multi-layer apartments in a fairly sedate looking container, but also riffing on the exteriors of these buildings in kind of light, somewhere between neoclassical and Art Deco style. Here, there's a reeded bottom to the base of the building. It's almost as if you had took a column that had flutes and rolled it out onto a flat sheet of paper. It's almost a fun detail for something it's a pretty sedate building. There are other moments of kind of whimsy in here. The dental moldings are a little bit fun. There are arches, there are bullnoses. It's exuberant, but it's never doing too much or calling too much attention to itself. Whenever you're designing a tall building like this, it's really important to spend your money where it's going to get the most bang for your buck. So what Candela did here by putting the reeding on the bottom two floors, a lot of the resources that went into stone carving went where someone can touch it and interact with it. Whereas the detailing on the top of the building, it's larger and more scaled to seeing it from 1,000 or 2,000 feet away. So it's upscale, it's maybe not quite as fine in its grain, but at the street level, it reads almost as equal. There's a bit of visual perspectival correction on a tall building like this. When this building was built in 1930s, was a really significant change, both in terms of this neighborhood, but also in the types of buildings. Park Avenue is really the last place where people built single family houses in Manhattan. There are really only two on this street that were even built. By this point, most people were moving into these large luxury apartment buildings in the newly gentrified Park Avenue corridor. 3 of the tallest buildings in New York are right behind me on West 57th Street. Why are they all on one street? It's partially building technology that's emerged very recently, but also reasons going all the way back to 1811 and the original layout of the city grid in the Commissioner's Plan. I'm Nick Potts, I'm an architect, and today we're going to be doing a walking tour of Billionaires Row in Midtown Manhattan. When the Commissioner's Plan laid out these streets in 1811, essentially set up a hierarchy of east-west streets between wide streets and narrow streets. The zoning bonuses of simply because you're on a wide street, you get that much more height and that much more ability to build tall as opposed to a narrower street such as 58th Street. And if you think about the grid plan of Manhattan, and 57th Street is the last wide street before you get to Central Park. So it's really the only one of the wide streets that has access to Central Park. So why is West 57th Street the only place in the city that could have become Billionaires Row? It's partially because of the original plan of the city in 1811. It's partially because of the proximity to Central Park and the commodification of views. And it's partially because of the building technology and how over the past 20 years, the advancements in materials and systems have enabled people to build so tall and so thin. Over my shoulder is the first super tall building that was built on West 57th Street, and really the seed of what would essentially become Billionaires Row of these super tall residential towers. So what is super tall? It's a tower over 1,000 feet. 157 is 1,004 feet tall, going all the way back to 1811. These sorts of buildings were not on anyone's radar. This idea of building super tall just didn't exist. And this building type, the residential skyscraper, also didn't exist. This is 2014, and you can see in 157 a little bit of trying to figure out what to actually do with a residential super tall. There wasn't a precedent for what a residential super tall building would be. So the architect, Christian Portson Park, really relied on metaphor, and the idea of the building was a waterfall. And as you see with these towers, anytime there's a new building type, similarly to the Woolworth building or a department store, there's always a struggle to find the right language. And this is probably one of those first experiments about, do we embrace the tallness? Do we try to hide it behind a metaphor? Besides the metaphor, it's a fairly straightforward, what you would think of as a commercial building that is actually a residential tower. When this building was proposed, it was almost like a shock. The only thing that was this tall in this area was the Time Warner Center, which is on the park and was controversial in its own right. But 157 freaked people out, and the imagery was almost terrifying. There were these overhead views, and it looked so tall. And now that you look at it among the buildings that have grown up around it, it actually looks quite short. And just in the short amount of time between 2014 and where we are in 2023, you can see how much this area has changed and how much the building typology has matured. The tall building behind my shoulder is 432 Park Avenue. This is 2015. The building is 1,397 feet tall and about 90 feet square. And the big innovation that happened with this building and why it's so tall and skinny, unlike 157, is that this building is all residential. You think about a typical office building is 300 feet long and 100 feet deep. It's a fragment of that. And that's because everything that's in this is apartments. So you don't have restaurants, you don't have office buildings that have peak loads of people coming and going. The discovery or the innovation with this building is realizing that with a residential tower, unlike an office tower where you need essentially one elevator for every 50,000 square feet, for a residential building, you need far fewer because you think about it, there'll be maybe 3 or 4 people on a floor at any given amount of time. Remember, this is one apartment per floor. So as in any luxury residential building, address matters. And Park Avenue, particularly north of 60th Street or the park, has an incredible amount of cachet. And so what the developers did here in assembling the lot assembly is they actually found a certain slice of a lot that fronted on Park Avenue and gave it a Park Avenue address to give it the cachet of Park Avenue, though the bulk of the building is between 56th and 57th Street. So all of the 57th Street super talls have, because they're a new building type, there's a huge amount of experimentation, even in the style of the building. And this building really is a sea change, and thinking of a tall building is not being glass. And you think about it in particular against 157, which was the building on 57th Street that immediately preceded this, which is all glass and kind of tethered to a metaphor. The architect on 432, Raphael Vignoli, decided to express this in a big exoskeleton grid. There isn't columns inside the building. What you see on the outside of the building is the structure. And the architects and structural engineers really brought back an older idea. Most skyscrapers have a curtain wall that does nothing, and then the columns and structure is all inboard. And with 432, the structure is the exterior, so there's not lost square footage. One other noticeable thing about 432 Park are the windbreaks periodically up the building. And this is another structural implication of building any tall building, is you have huge wind loads. If you create an open pore space up the building so the wind can move through, it drastically reduces the pressure of the building. Behind me is 111 West 57th Street, and from this far away, one of the most noticeable things about the building is really its shape. This is the narrowest skyscraper in the world, and in order to achieve that sort of slenderness, there's a huge amount of engineering that goes into it. Notably the sidewalls, which are solid because the building essentially acts like a very vertical I-beam where the end walls are solid. It's really 2 townhouses wide. If you think about the structure of Manhattan blocks and these 25-foot wide lots, it's just a little bit wider than 2 townhouse lots and essentially as deep as one. So just imagine something essentially the width of 2 townhouses stretched up to 1,425 feet. And what 111 does is it takes that sort of setback tower form that we're familiar with from the 1916 zoning code and essentially multiplies it. And rather than have them be every 30 feet, it's actually at a very reasonable residential 7 feet 6 inches or so. So to provide essentially something that's scalable for a terrace for the resident. So the relationship of the 1916 zoning code and the 1920s commercial setback towers really resulted in this feathered setback shape where many residences and many apartments could get terraces rather than essentially 3, which is what the sky exposure plane for a deeper setback would have mandated. So this is a building that's really all about New York and trying to respond to both the city and the historical skyscrapers that existed before it, which were also experimental in their time, and also to the building that it's a part of. 111 West 57th Street is technically an addition to the 1925 Steinway and Sons building by Warren and Wetmore, who are the same architects as Grand Central Station. And the Steinway building is landmarked, which is something that the developer was supportive of. It actually rests within a courtyard of it, so it doesn't change the Steinway building, but it uses the air rights from a landmark building and transfers them over into the adjacent lot. All of these buildings are very complex, three-dimensional financial and zoning puzzles. So the fact that this is added onto the Steinway building kind of talks a little bit about some of the history of West 57th Street between its first era, when it was a mansion neighborhood that clustered around the Vanderbilt House, to its current state as a row of super talls. In that in-between time, it was really a corridor that catered towards musicians, and Carnegie Hall is across the street, and that caused the clustering of people and companies that catered towards people who used and worked in Carnegie Hall to settle nearby. So Steinway & Sons built their headquarters across from Carnegie Hall essentially to do this. And at one point, 57th Street was known as Piano Row. The developer took a huge amount of care towards making sure that the addition both responded to and respected the landmark and brought its language into the future. And the materials are really used to bridge between 1925 West 57th Street and 2023 West 57th Street. If you look at the terracotta on the end walls, it's taking the terracotta language, which was used a lot in the 1920s, using some motifs from the Steinway building. If you look at some of the molding profiles around the front entrances, it's essentially translated into the shapes of the terracotta and then manipulated to create shadows. It responds to the sun and to the changes in the day and makes the building something different to look at and interesting through the course of the days, weeks, and years. And in the interest of full disclosure, and also in case you haven't noticed how excited I am by this building, I was actually the project architect for this building during its design phases with Shop Architects. The setback terraces, 111 has several of these, but at the windbreak floors, it's really one of the only places that there's a terrace that's not accessible to building residents. And we even have a chance to get up into the top one of those windbreak floors right now. So right now we're on the 86th floor of 111 West 57th Street. This is a windbreak floor. So similarly to 432 Park, these very skinny towers benefit greatly from having a windbreak, or a periodic hole through the building where wind can travel through and reduce the wind pressures moving across the building. So you have these on this floor and two more below us on 111, and 432 Park has some as well that you can see off in the distance. So in addition to these windbreak floors, there are also mechanical floors that exist. On 432 Park, they're actually within the same assembly, so that donut in the middle is where the mechanical equipment is, and they're also double height, so it's a zoning height bonus that they use. Here on 111, the floor we're on is simply a windbreak floor. The mechanical floors are directly below us, and the tune-mast damper, which helps balance the building from swaying in the wind, is directly above us. Another interesting thing here is it's also one of the few places where we can see the terracotta up close, because the terracotta on 111 is on the side walls and not necessarily accessible to people. These finials at the end of each of the setback terraces are really the only three-dimensional expression of it, and it's similar to, the team when they were working through this was thinking of the similar finials on the Chrysler building. If you look at the Eagles, they're about the same size as these. So, elements that are like this, that are twice as tall as a person, look pretty small from far away, and that's a bit of the kind of eye trickery that happens whenever you're dealing with a very tall or large building. Right now we're outside of 35 West 57th Street, and this is the only survivor of West 57th Street's first residential phase, when it was anchored by the Vanderbilt Mansion just at the end of this block at 5th Avenue and 57th Street, which was the largest house in the city at the time. And this building, which was actually built for W.K. Vanderbilt, his brother's daughter, as a wedding gift, were exactly the kind of people that were living here. It was people who were related to or wanted to be near the center of power and the biggest house in town. However, this didn't last long. The house was built in 1891. By 1898, it had become too hustling and bustling. This was kind of the dawn of Midtown, which is what it is now. Anything south of the park was noisy and commercial. And by 1898, the bride had moved further uptown. You can see in the ornamentation this kind of Beaux-Arts brownstone carving. This was a fairly impressive townhouse in its day, but you can see the scale of it looks almost like a toy next to the new buildings. Behind me is the Osborne, and this is the flip side to the townhouse residential development that was happening just a few blocks further to the east, around the Vanderbilt House. By the 1880s, this was already starting to emerge as an apartment house district, and the Osborne was really the crown jewel in this. This was obviously a very high-class luxury building. Osborne, who is the developer of this, owned a stone cutting business, so it's very heavy masonry because he could get the material and was probably profiting on it. So this was a very tall building of its its time. And if you compare it with the townhouse further down the street, you can imagine an 11-story building like this kind of looming over its neighborhood, almost as a prelude to what would come in the later phases of what would become Billionaires Row. In terms of the height and the technology, this is really at the maximum of what would have been built out of a masonry building of its time. You can think of it as being similar to the Monadnock building in Chicago, which is 16 stories and brick and has massive walls. So the Osborne, it's a stone building, but it still is similarly hefty and bulky and really taking advantage of the weight of its material. And it's a Romanesque style building, which is perfectly suited to that. It's heavy, it's about expressing arches, it's about heavy materials. It's an interesting juxtaposition to think about the Osborne, which was the tallest building of its district of its time back in 1890, to towering over it, Central Park Tower at more than 100 stories. Above me is the tallest residential tower in the world, Central Park Tower. This is 1,550 feet, and similar to Steinway or 111 West 57th Street, it makes a creative use of a zoning bonus. You can see how it cantilevers out over another landmark building. The Art Students League immediately next door to it, both giving them air rights to build over the rights that could have been built over the Art Students League, but also crucially letting the building rotate so there's more frontage by going over the Art Students League to get a little bit more frontage facing the park, which is just on the other side of the building from us. Aside from that, this is probably the most conventional of the super tall buildings on 57th Street in terms of skyscraper design. You can see, like 157, it's a glass tower. It's wrapped with glass on all four sides, which gives views in a 360-degree direction from the building. The floor plates are larger than what you see on 111 and on 432 Park, because there is enough room with the Art Students League to project out a little bit and get a few more apartments on each floor. So instead of something like 432 where there's 2 or 1 apartments per floor, or 111 where there's simply 1, this has multiple apartments, particularly in the lower floors, 4 or 5 on the lowest tier, then 3, then 2, then 1. So you can kind of see each vertical striation as a different model of planning the inside of the building, going from large to small. This building also crucially makes the use of the lower parts of the building, which don't really make economic sense because they don't have views towards the park, for other uses. There's a Nordstrom department store occupying the ground floor real estate space to activate the ground plane. And then in between, there's also a hotel. Even though Central Park Tower is probably the most conservative in terms of architectural expression, it's really the culmination of the lessons learned on the other super tall towers that have been built over 111 West 57th Street. If you think about its height at 1,550 feet, 150 feet taller than 432 Park, which was kind of the first major one of these, and also the real estate potential. This has a triplex that just listed for $250 million. So these buildings are both a competitive race to the top in terms of height, but also in terms of speculation and finding unlocked potential to recoup the investment of buying what ultimately is very expensive real estate. And this, the ultimate expression of Billionaires Row and all we've been talking about with these super tall towers, really could have only happened here on West 57th Street. Grand Central Terminal might look tiny compared to the buildings around it, but what you can see is nearly 40 acres of underground train tracks covering 10 blocks of prime New York City real estate. And this hidden rail yard creates serious problems for the tall buildings on top of it, including one brand new super tall that will change the New York City skyline forever. I'm Nick Potts, I'm an architect, and today we're doing a walking tour of what's hiding behind Grand Central Station in New York City. When Grand Central was initially built in its previous iterations, the trains were just sitting out in open air, which, because we're in the middle of the city, it was a huge problem. You have this huge parking lot for trains, limiting the amount of prime New York City real estate. And the solution that they came up with was to actually lower the trains after the railway was electrified and start developing ways of building on top of it. The Grand Central Railroad essentially created 10 prime blocks of Manhattan real estate at the most important intersection in the city. Part and parcel with the development of Grand Central Terminal was what was called Terminal City, a real estate development deal behind it in the area that was being vacated by the trains. And it took a while for them to really figure out what to do. And what was seen as a prime development back in the 19-teens and 1920s was hotels and smaller residential scale properties. Over time, as the land values increased, it demanded larger buildings, and the typology also changed to office buildings where there's a daily in and out of thousands of people. And so as the buildings got larger, the need for the buildings to perform in an efficient way was intensified. The office building market is very competitive, and at the top of all office buildings are what are called Class A office buildings, which are really your prime real estate in great locations that provide almost zero friction to their building occupants. Having enough elevators, having enough points of contact where nobody is being held up through friction or through knots or snags in traffic. This is New York, and time is money. If you're a tenant in a building at the most important intersection in the most important building in the city, sitting for 30 seconds as you're waiting for your elevator is not going to cut it. So these buildings need to be fast, they need to be efficient, and they need to work. And a high-speed elevator requires a pit, which because we're on top of a rail yard, there's no basement to take these elevator pits. However, crucially, you also can't have elevator pits for high-speed elevators where there are active rail yards, because the elevators would be where the trains are. So this new urban grid that was created is both incredibly valuable but incredibly tricky for anyone designing a new building to figure out. So let's see how some of the other buildings north of Grand Central worked with their constraints and developed innovative solutions to solve the problem of building on top of a rail yard. Over my shoulder is the MetLife building, originally built as the Pan Am building in 1963 by Emery Roth, Pietro Bellusci, and Walter Gropius. This is really one of the most successful buildings in dealing with its constraints, partially because it exists within the Grand Central footprint. It almost feels like it's part of the station. So as you'll see in a lot of these buildings, the solution to this difficult site was to completely elevate the lobby into a sky lobby. You go up escalators and walk around, and you wait on your raised level. This is still one of the largest office buildings in the city, nearly 2.8 million square feet. There are tens of thousands of people in this building at any moment, and at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, you do not want people waiting in elevator lobbies and being frustrated by having to wait in lines. This building does have a raised lobby, meaning the elevators aren't accessed directly from the street. But because it's inside of Grand Central Terminal, you really don't notice it. The elevators exist 2 levels above the floor level of Grand Central. And part of the reason you don't notice that the escalators that take you into the lobby of the MetLife building are accessed directly from the concourse of Grand Central with the blue ceiling and the Apple Store. It is directly connected. Like any transportation building, like an airport, like a train station, you're used to being on escalators and stairs, so you barely recognize the vertical move you're making. And in a way, it's almost like having the famous concourse of Grand Central Station as the lobby of your building. It also has the viaduct that you can see behind me, which is its primary means of getting vehicles into the building. There's a 400-car parking garage that's accessed directly from this roadway. There's also a black car entrance for VIPs. Interestingly, this also had a heliport on the top of the building that was used briefly and finally shut down in 1977 after a tragic accident.
With the opening of a helicopter landing pad atop a midtown skyscraper, even blasé New Yorkers were turning their eyes skyward as the choppers went through test runs before the official opening.
This building really does take advantage of the original design for Grand Central, which already decoupled the train traffic from the level of the street. And it continues this kind of theme of untying or decoupling circulation from competing systems in order to relieve congestion. Behind me is the Helmsley building. This was built as the Grand Central building for the Grand Central Railroad. This is interesting for many reasons. One is that it was the centerpiece of the terminal city development. One of the others is that it's one of very few terminal buildings or axial buildings that we have in New York City. Because New York City is built on a grid, there are very few opportunities for a building to be at the end of a street. And the Grand Central Railroad and its architects, Warren Wetmore, really took advantage of this. They built a very monumental tower, capped with a very ornamented crown. It was built in 1926. This is before central air conditioning. This was before the advent of fluorescent light. And so the floor plates are quite small. And you compare that with Pan Am, where the floor plates are 55,000 square feet. The floor plates in the tower of the Grand Central building were about 15,000 square feet. Not exactly ideal for today's office environments where you need a huge amount of contiguous floor space. And so a building like this just doesn't perform to the same level that any of the new Class A office buildings, or frankly even Pan Am, deliver. Of the office buildings in Terminal City, the Helmsley building is really the only one that has its elevator lobbies directly at street level. And the way they did this is by creating these micro elevator lobbies essentially in the space of the platform between the tracks. And you can actually read how it negotiates its relationship with the railroad below. You can see in the openings of the viaduct and also the lobby how it's aligning itself with the train tracks below it. Essentially, the open areas are where the trains are, the closed areas are where the platforms are and where columns can be. The elevators here, because the narrowness of the platform, you're dealing with about 20 feet max. It's these very odd kind of two-car elevator banks. Totally not efficient. There hadn't been a lot of tall office buildings built in 1926, so they're starting to push towards the efficiency in the world we live in now, but it still is very much not a building of today. And even though the Helmsley building isn't the most efficient, because it has this iconic role at the center of Terminal City, it was rather quickly landmarked, and that's why it still is here. It's in good company as a building that is well known, but is possibly not performing at the level of a Class A office building. You think about the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the Woolworth Building. These are buildings that similarly were groundbreaking icons of the city, but they just simply don't perform on the level of the newer, more efficient, more optimized office buildings. Over my shoulder and under construction is 270 Park Avenue. This is actually the third building to occupy the site since Terminal City was developed less than 100 years ago. So you can imagine there's this constant need to remake and to make these buildings more efficient. A very interesting thing to note about this is that the building that existed in its site was already an important building in its own right. So the previous occupant of this site was the Union Carbide building, designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, with Nathalie Blois, yes, a female architect working in the 1950s as its lead designer. Why would the owner redevelop a building that had such an important role in architectural history? It really comes down to efficiency. The original building had 24 elevators and about 1 million square feet. The new building is not a huge amount larger. It's been projected it's about 1.3 and 1.5 million square feet, but it likely has nearly 50 elevators given that amount of square footage. So it's less about creating a much bigger building and doubling or tripling the size of the building. It's more about being more efficient with super high technology, super high speed elevators, and frankly just better metrics is the reason why you do something so huge, so ambitious at the cost of something that already had a huge amount of embedded value in it, namely a completed building. There's a sea change in how the lobby of the original Union Carbide building and this one, think about the lobby and the entire lobby experience. The Union Carbide building's solution to this difficult site was to completely elevate the lobby into a sky lobby, one level above, which was presented almost as a gallery. The philosophy of the old building was to celebrate the sky lobby. It was this iconic, top-lit, gallery-like space that everyone entering the building had to go up escalators and walk around, and you wait on your raised level. The new building has obviously many more elevators, and the imagery that has been presented to the building suggests that they're opting for something much more subtle, much more ramped, much more cascading as a way of minimizing the fact that you're moving up a floor. And what do you think the best solution is? Let us know in the comments. And for more stories like this, be sure to check out our other episodes of Walking Tour. This elevated green space weaves through dozens of buildings by some of the world's most famous architects. But none of this would exist if it weren't for hundreds of deaths on 10th Avenue nearly 2 centuries ago. I'm Nick Potts, I'm an architect, and today we're doing a walking tour of the High Line in New York City. This is the High Line Park in New York City's Meatpacking District. This is a neighborhood that got its name from the industry that it once served, which provided beef, veal, pork to markets and cities all throughout the northeastern United States. It also had a lot of railroad traffic that originally was at the same level of the street, which turned out to be quite dangerous. Back in the 1800s, early 1900s, this area was known as Death Avenue, and several hundred people actually lost their lives due to collisions with trains. Because of this dangerous situation, the city eventually built an elevated rail line to permit the huge scale of industrial production to coexist with the street level activity of an active neighborhood within a growing metropolis. After its decline as an industrial neighborhood in the middle of the 20th century, this neighborhood searched for a new identity. The redevelopment of the High Line from an abandoned rail line to a vibrant green space catalyzed more development in the last 15 years in this part of New York City than anywhere else. It's really a unique situation to have this concentration of contemporary buildings designed by star architects in one area. And without the High Line, none of these buildings would have been built. Behind me is the Chelsea Market. But if we take a bit of a trip back into history, the reason why the High Line as a rail line existed was because of a building like this. This was a Nabisco factory. And so because this was an industrial district prior to its current form, a lot of the buildings around here would have been similar to this. Multi-level industrial warehouse buildings connected to the High Line and connected the goods being made in this building into the rail system in the country. You can see there are these sky bridges that connect horizontally from site to site in these very authentic relics of its industrial past. As the meatpacking industry and industrialized food production moved elsewhere, this neighborhood went into decline, and relics that were left really contributed to its decline further and further. And it took the redevelopment of places like the Chelsea Market and the High Line itself to really kind of bring people back and take what had been a bit of an urban liability and turn it into an asset. In terms of the redevelopment of the Chelsea Market, it was a bit of a pioneer. It was one of the first projects in the country that kind of took advantage of these disused industrial sites and turned them into commodified marketplaces, kind of glamorizing the grit, rusted steel, exposed brick, this kind of romanticized industrial style. And so a lot of those warehouses, buildings kind of remade themselves into new spaces within their existing forms, spaces for creative industries, for film studios originally, for art galleries. There are people like Diane von Furstenberg who very early came into this neighborhood and built a headquarters and a studio. And the sorts of things that showed up in this building, because it was converted into a market, it really planted the seed for retail within this very small footprint of what used to be an industrial neighborhood. Behind me is 520 West 28th Street. This is a building designed by British Iraqi architect Zaha Hadid. This is an example of what we would call a designer building. It's a phenomenon that you see pop up again and again around the High Line. In the 15 years since the High Line opened in 2009, it's attracted a collection of buildings from the most famous architects practicing in the world. People like Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Jeannie Gang, Shigeru Ban. It's almost like a collection of designer clothes in a fancy department store. It's a phenomenon that's really unique in New York City to have this level of famous architects working in one area, and it's all enabled by this very famous, very public space, the High Line, that catalyzed all of these luxury developments. These buildings are really about a brand, and they're about a premium product being marketed to buyers both from New York and globally. You think about a building like 520 West 28th, which is an apartment building, and this very public element in this aspect of people taking pictures of your building while you're inside of a very private, intimate space is really engaging in this game of urban peacocking of, it's a private building that wouldn't exist without existing on a very public right of way, and it's showing off in a very kind of ostentatious, look at me sort of way, but it's still encompassing and holding a lot of very private spaces. So like a lot of designer goods, there's almost an aspect of look but don't touch with this. None of the buildings on the High Line can be entered from the High Line. So you're looking, you're interacting visually, but you're physically not permitted. The buildings are actually separated. None of them touch. You don't have doors going onto the High Line. And so the relationship that these buildings have is purely visual. You're looking at it as an amenity, but you're physically not engaging with it. Behind me is the Whitney Museum of American Art. And in terms of location, the Whitney is also the first building a person encounters as they enter the High Line from the south. It's this very kind of opaque building that doesn't really engage with this amazing linear realm that the High Line has created. Really, the Whitney was trying to, add their piece as a public building as opposed to the private architect buildings that the rest of the High Line has. This is kind of your standard approach when you're building a new museum, is to attach a name to it. Here it's Renzo Piano. This is after the Chelsea Market. This is after kind of the first phase of kind of the retail takeover of this neighborhood happened. But what's interesting about it is partially how it references the industrial history of this site. It's almost appropriating the language of a factory here in a very vertical form. You can see the vertical, aggressive, almost industrial expression of the building, which is a fairly interesting expression for an art museum. The Whitney really doesn't showcase anything about what's going inside the building. It looks opaque, it's kind of mysterious. The only time that you really engage with the High Line is when you're inside the Whitney, looking down from the balconies or from space at the ends of the galleries that are designed to look out over the High Line. As the most public building on the High Line, it's interesting to think that it's also one of the most unapproachable and severe. Would it have made sense to be a little bit more public facing, be a little bit more welcoming? Over my shoulder is Hudson Yards. It's a 15 million square foot development at the northern end of the High Line. The High Line grew from south to north, starting around 14th Street. Here we're at 30th Street. And by the time this was ready to be built, it was very apparent that the West Side could take a development of this size. Because the High Line was so successful in bringing people and bringing money to this area, developers decided to go big and to create this major commercial, residential, and retail development right here at the northern end of the High Line. Here at 30th Street, this is really where the spur of the High Line connected back into the train network. If you think back to the origins of this place, everything behind me was originally essentially a parking lot for trains, ringed by a ramp that brought the trains that ran on the High Line up a level to separate them from the street grid. At Hudson Yards, they were able to raise the ground plane up to the level of the High Line. It's really the reconnection of the pedestrian flow that the High Line enables into the new shopping center, into the new public plaza, where the High Line originally connected the trains back into the train network. Now people essentially have taken on that role through this direct connection from the raised level of the High Line to the raised level of Hudson Yards. You think about the Shed, you think about these giant towers, you think about the Vessel, you think about these mega developments and this mall. It was all really made possible by the proving of the thesis of the High Line, which is that these designer buildings, these kind of mini branded moments can coalesce into an intense, vibrant, urban setting. And over the last 15 years, the success of the High Line really catalyzed the complete redevelopment of the Meatpacking District. The High Line has really proved itself out, and the fact that the Meatpacking District and Hudson Yards have been the center of development and the largest redevelopment project in Manhattan, it's really because of the seed that was planted with the High Line. For more stories about how architecture can transform our built environment, check out our other episodes of Walking Tour. Today we're in Greenwich Village in New York City. My name's Nick Potts, I'm an architect, and we're going to be doing a walking tour of the neighborhood. When New York City first started, the main city was really centered around Wall Street, and that's where people lived and it's where people worked. This was it was farmland in the far hinterlands. Because it was outside of the city, this is where things that weren't seen as desirable ended up, like Washington Square Park, which at one time was the Potter's Field, which was the cemetery where if you couldn't afford a proper burial, you would end up here. When this was redeveloped in the 1820s, ostensibly they were supposed to remove a lot of the bodies, but it's been estimated there are still 20,000 burials underground. And actually when they built the arch, they discovered quite a few. So there's definitely another city underneath that we're not really aware of in its current incarnation. So this existed right around the same time that the Commissioner's Plan laid out the street grid, which is why the streets don't quite align with the numbered streets and avenues that we currently think of, with the exception of Fifth Avenue, which is the centerpiece that shoots right through the arch. Essentially everything to the north of here was part of the Commissioner's Plan. The original idea of Washington Square Park, when it was redeveloped away from being a cemetery, was as a front yard for townhouse developments, such as the one on the right, which was built in the 1830s. When this was redeveloped and those townhouses were built, the upper classes felt comfortable moving up here. The arch itself is kind of interesting. It was originally built as a temporary arch out of plaster, which is a common thing. During the World's Fairs, a lot of the buildings were built out of this material, which is called staff. It's simply because it was quick and fast and cheap. This one and quite a few World's Fair buildings in other cities that became permanent, they would have to rebuild out of marble. And it was really rebuilt because it was popular and it became a rallying point in this newly established, or relatively newly established park is a focal point. And it's also one of the only moments urbanistically in New York where we have a termination of a street. So it makes sense. Like in Paris with the Champs-Élysées and the Arc de Triomphe, we have our little Washington Square arch. Right now we're on Washington Square North, right in front of one of the most important Greek Revival townhouse developments in New York. So the houses are almost perfect examples of Greek Revival style. You can see the columns at the porticos. The fences have Greek motifs such as keys and anthemions, which are the kind of flowery shapes on top of the fences. Everything here is intact from the 1830s. So it's really a remarkable achievement in preservation and how the city has kind of kept its best buildings. When these were first built, they were really meant to be upper class residences, kind of the upper crust of society did live in these. Eventually they became a little bit more bohemian. Artists would move in, but the fabric of the buildings is, at least from the street front, totally intact. So they were redeveloped in the 1930s by NYU, who is the majority landholder here, into an apartment building. But remarkably, even though there's essentially a whole new building behind them, you don't really see it. That all happens behind the facade. What looks like a series of individual townhouses with their own front door, there's an apartment building that's accessed via a side entrance on Fifth Avenue. So the stoops, the marble paving, the fences, they're all pretty much as they were in 1833. And really the only telltale sign is the fact the cornice line is just slightly higher to seek in another floor. Right now we're on West 11th Street in Greenwich Village. So if you've spent a lot of time in the village, you've probably realized there's not a lot of new buildings. And generally, if there's a new building, there's a pretty good reason why. Case in point, the Weatherman House. In 1970, there was a bombing in this place by an anti-Vietnam War activist group. Hence, that building no longer existed. And given the fact that the village is heavily landmarked, the conflict about what to build in its place became a really heated event. So the village was essentially baked in amber in the 1960s when it became the first major neighborhood in Manhattan that was given landmark status. So that meant is every building is assessed and its characters are defined, and you really can't change anything beyond that without going to landmarks and getting major approval. When you're applying to landmarks, there's a lot of assessment about window types, window profiles of the sashes, and material. And here, you can see the red brick is essentially the same as what you see elsewhere. So, they would want to look at that and make sure that it's contextual with the rest of the buildings on the street. The bombing was in 1970. I believe this building was designed in 1970 and not built until 1978. So you can imagine the sort of negotiations just to get something like this built in a post-landmarked Greenwich Village. What's really 1970s and postmodern about this is that it's playing around with shape and kind of taking the motifs of the historic architecture and almost making it a cut and paste, like almost a joke on itself. So, the top of the building, if you kind of cut off the top, that's a federal townhouse. But then Hugh Hardy, the architect, twisted the main front ostensibly to give the rooms more light. So it's playing around with the idea of what would a federal townhouse in 1978, which was when this was built, look like. Right now we're on West 8th Street outside of the first home of the Whitney Museum of American Art. So this building is really an important moment in the change of Greenwich Village from a residential neighborhood for the well-off to a neighborhood for bohemians. So these three buildings were originally three Greek Revival townhouses built in the 1830s. In the 1930s, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney bought these and combined them into one single house and a studio. And then in the late 1930s, they eventually became a museum. There's a studio in the back facing McDougal Alley. Because she was an amateur artist, she wanted a place where she could make art and live amongst artists and still have the trappings of a large house. Eventually this became the Whitney Museum, and this is the studio school, but you can still see the building as it is looks much as it did. What's interesting is that even though it looks like one building, it is still very clearly three separate townhouses. You can see the three bays of each, and it's been unified under this pink stucco facade with a monumental, very Art Deco entrance with the eagle. So it's a mixture of the 1830s and 1930s styles. So you see a lot of the motifs of Art Deco style. You see fluting, you see abstracted, kind of vaguely classical motifs, but everything is very kind of abstracted, softened, and almost sanded down. The original federal townhouses weren't, seen as being a contemporary or artistic aesthetic, and so you see these reshapings. But because this was in style in 1931, we've got a 1931 facade on what were 100-year-old buildings at the time. Right now we're on Waverly Place between 6th Avenue and the Park. So in the 1920s, there was a huge trend for bohemians to move into the village. The developers of these buildings were trying to appeal to the creative class and kind of remake these fusty 1830s buildings into something new and contemporary, oftentimes using very kind of fantastical styles. And the building behind me is a really great example of this. It's really, stylistically, it's somewhere between like a Jugendstil European style, Art Deco, it's maybe a little bit Flemish. It's just doing a whole lot. It's really to project nothing else than fun and whimsy. And a building like this, which was renovated in the 1920s, was really taking the ideas of someone named Frederick Sterner, who was renovating buildings around Gramercy Park in a similar sort of neo-Mediterranean European style. The windows that were used in these, we see a lot in Greenwich Village. It was these studio windows. As you think about the narrow vertical slits of a Greek Revival townhouse, really not conducive to painting. And so even if these weren't fully marketed towards artists, the horizontal paned window projected studio and creativity. Right now we're on the corner of Grove Street where it meets 7th Avenue. So this is one of these kind of amazing scars of Greenwich Village as it was being integrated into the street grid of New York City. And the building back to my left is kind of a perfect example of that. You can see where the 7th Avenue literally sliced off a corner of the building and they kept the front and kind of exposed the side. 7th Avenue was sliced through the existing Greenwich Village fabric in the 1920s, primarily to run the independent subway underneath. But to do that, there was obviously a cost. And to this day, 7th Avenue doesn't quite have the same density or the feeling of the rest of the village, frankly, because there are these weird moments where you're looking at the backs and sides of buildings that had never been meant to be seen. They literally would just demolish a corner of the building and slap a corner of new facade on it. Thankfully, that one, probably the reason that building was preserved rather than torn down, is at the door where the stair is. The red brick on the left, that was the front of the building, and it would have had 2 more windows like any other New York City fabric building. It's 3 bays wide. The more brownish brick on the right, that was never meant to be seen. It was a light court. That was a tenement building, so you can kind of see where the apartment had a light shaft. On most brick buildings, there's usually a face brick on the facade side, which has a slightly higher level of finish, maybe a nicer glaze, maybe a prime spot in the oven, versus the brick that's used on the back of a building, which is much more workaday, kind of raw clay without any additives or any kind of thought about its appearance. You can kind of understand the economics of a brick building where you don't want to spend money on things people don't see. Even though these moments are kind of awkward, it's really a great, almost like an X-ray snapshot into the workings of our city. Right now we're on the corner of Bedford Street and Commerce Street outside the oldest house in the village. So this is really a very classic late 18th century federal style. The detailing is incredibly simple. The lintels of the windows, rather than a very kind of carved expression or frankly even a brick arch, they're a slab of stone. So it's a very kind of almost like rudimentary means of construction. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's honest. That sort of recessed door, you see them in some of these federal style houses. Again, it's a very simple expression. You're not seeing a portico or any sort of porches. Because of that, you don't have shelter. And so the shelter is really happening within the footprint of the house. What's really interesting about this one, unlike others, is that you see the exposed sidewall and these 2 almost like peepholes that are showing where the hearths are. So it has 2 fireplaces, kind of a classic sidewall expression. But again, we don't usually see this on a corner, so it's interesting to kind of have that revealed to us. And the wood is covering everything else. The building is brick frame, so it's a little bit strange why they would have applied the siding, but if the chimneys were exposed, you would see the vertical line going all the way up to the roof. And here, we're just seeing where the fireplace is. This, interestingly, was modified in the early 20th century, so it has our studio window, again, to appeal to a new bohemian class. So even though this house is very old and it's in a great state of preservation, it still has been modified for a new lifestyle. So these houses were almost always 2.5 stories when they were first built. As the land became more valuable, as people became aware of the fact that they could rent out apartments within their townhouses, you'll see these expansions into fully 3-story buildings, sometimes going even into 4-story buildings. A street like this, that's primarily, 1799 through 1830. The expansions happen, in the 1850s and beyond. So a house like this, typically a Federal and Greek Revival townhouse will have a Flemish bond where the brick is horizontal and short. And that's because the brick of these buildings is several layers thick, and it's a way of weaving the layers of brick together. When you see expansions of these houses, you almost inevitably see a change in the brick type to a more common bond, which is a standard horizontal with a stretcher course, where the tying together happens essentially every 4 or 5 rows rather than within the weaving of the brick. And it's a great way of telling whether a house has been expanded vertically. So you're seeing, changes happen. Sometimes you can date a building that had a vertical expansion to its cornice. If it has an Italianate cornice, which is more curvy and superfluous, that tells you this happened, in the 1860s and the 1870s. So you can kind of read a bit of the kind of prevailing styles and what's going on with the expansions. Right now we're on the corner of Grove and Christopher Streets in the West Village. So right now we're in kind of the heart of the more bohemian parts of the village. So neighborhoods like this were exactly what Jane Jacobs, when she was writing about these sorts of neighborhoods, was talking about. There's eyes on the street, there's liveliness, there's a diversity of types of uses, types of people, and that's really what causes the stability of a neighborhood like this, is there's enough to adapt and shift over time. You see restaurants at the bases of buildings, so there's activity on 24/7. We have buildings like the Northern Dispensary that are serving a community need. This one, in fact, had been here since the 1830s as a free community clinic. Very simple kind of workaday sort of buildings. You see some kind of high-style details on a civic building like the Northern Dispensary. You see, again, our Greek key motif and our eranthemion in the ironwork, but otherwise it's a pretty simple, straightforward red brick building. When this was originally developed in the 1830s, were they were working people. They were people who worked in brass foundries, places like P. Guerin that's still in business up on Jane Street. Bricklayers, house painters, people who worked in the docks more towards the river. So it's really a neighborhood for people to live their everyday lives. These were originally townhouses and residential buildings, and that's kind of the beauty of these 20-foot townhouses, is it's a really great module for creating a storefront on the ground floor, and kind of a testament to the adaptability of this building type. A neighborhood like this has almost become the victim of its own success. You've noticed it hasn't changed since the 1960s, because to preserve it, to keep it from becoming something else, it had to become essentially baked in its final form. I'm Nick Potts, I'm an architect. Today we're on Wall Street and we'll be doing an architectural walking tour of the neighborhood. Wall Street has this reputation of being the financial capital of the country, but the reason it's called Wall Street is that we're at the edge of the settlement of New Amsterdam, where really the city stopped right where it is, and there is a defensive wall. Other things that happen at the edge of any settlement is trade, and that's exactly what is happening here in the Wall Street area. As there was trade amongst the indigenous populations immediately to the north, as the colonists were finding things to sell to them. There's also the sale and trading of goods and commodities, and because this is America in that period, also the sale of people through slavery. So this is really the nexus of all the things that were being traded in America at this time. Right now we are on Wall Street at Broad Street, right outside of the New York Stock Exchange. Stock trading had existed on this site really as far back into the early 18th century. There was a series of outdoor auctions that actually took place here on Wall Street around 1793 that started to become formalized. So these outdoor markets, which originally took place under a tree, started taking place within coffee shops. And as technology developed and the whole business of trading commodities became more formalized, there's a need for space to do it. And as electricity, the telegraph made it possible for people in offices to communicate down through ticker tape to people on a floor, you started having a need for a trading floor. And so this building is really that sort of technology. What you have underneath this big neoclassical pediment is a giant floor where stock traders could mingle with one another. These giant windows are bathing light in this very deep, large space. The tall windows, height means light. And so what you have is a very high technology building hiding under the respectability of a Roman temple front. And you see the columns, these Corinthian columns, which are almost religious. But you start looking closer and it's much more Americanized. If you look at the sculpture in the pediment, these aren't gods. It's actually a representation of industry and the industry that made prosperity. You see mining, you see agriculture, you see industrial manufacturing, you see sciences, all represented in this pediment as if they're the things being worshipped within this modern temple. Another Another interesting thing to note about this, obviously there's no offices in this building. It's increasingly, as technology, lighting, and the ability to put more people in a large space became more pronounced, trading floors needed much more space. So this is really, it's actually quite small, and it's smaller than what you do now. The building stock that exists here really can't house modern finance, so a lot of the banks have moved uptown or further out where they can build much larger floor plates. And a lot of these buildings, because they're quite narrow, have been retrofitted as residences and hotels where you can have much narrower floor plates. We are on the corner of Liberty Street and Nassau Street, right in front of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. When the Federal Reserve System was created, New York could not appear to be the only one, so there are branch or actually equal Federal Reserves scattered across the country. And this building, though it looks very ancient, it's appropriating Renaissance forms. It's actually quite new, obviously because the Federal Reserve System didn't exist before then. In spite of its newness, it's trying as hard as it can to look old and stable and permanent. And if you look at the stone, so it's actually made of two types of stone. The more yellow blocks are sandstone, the whiter ones are limestone. So that sort of mixing of different stones was meant to look as if it had aged. It's similar to what you see at Yale, where they threw acid at buildings to kind of create a bit of instant history. And you can see by the size of the people walking by the stones of the building, just how huge these stones are. These are meant to express their permanence and their solidity. Here they went even one step further and did something called pulvinating, which is, it almost looks like a pillow. It's this giant rounded corner. And so that's expressing the bigness and the permanence and the stability of the building and our financial system. The type of building or the style of building that they appropriated for this, Renaissance Palazzo, they were both places of commerce and fortresses for, if you think about the Medici and the extremely wealthy families in Renaissance Florence, these buildings were fortresses. And there's a little bit of that going on here. It's slightly castle-y. You see the crenellations at the top of the building. There's a tower. So it's meant to look stable and permanent and as if it could stand up to the onslaught of a war, should that happen, which is fitting for an institution that's meant to, house the reserves of our nation's finances. The metalwork is kind of doing two things here. For one, it looks impenetrable and fortress-like. It's also, if you look closer, a work of art. And this is the work of Samuel Yellin, who was the master of ironwork. He worked out of Philadelphia and did some of the most extraordinary ironwork of this country in the middle of the turn of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Now we are outside of 55 Wall Street. This is a building that's interesting in that it's changed over the course of its lifetime. It started in the 1840s as the Merchants Exchange. You can see on the bottom of the building, that was the original building. It was load-bearing masonry, a very simple Greek Revival sort of building, one row of Ionic columns. As the whole national financial market matured, that sort of exchange no longer needed a building like that. So they moved off, it became a customs house, and it became, in 1907, the headquarters for National City Bank. And so in order to make this their headquarters, taking over this more kind of publicly facing market building, they extended it vertically upwards in a steel building. And you can see the intersection of two styles. The very simple Ionic columns on the lower part of the building are superseded by these giant Corinthian columns in the Citibank expansion. Part of the reason that Wall Street has also been important is that it meets on the East River, one of the most important areas for offloading goods and shipments for the New World. So this building, at one point after the Merchants Exchange had moved out, was the customs house. So it was the place where customs and duties on goods coming in for the port were assessed. So the Merchants Exchange, when this was still the original tenant of the building, built something that looked like a temple, again to show that it was viable and stable. And there's no better way to do that than to borrow from antiquity and classicism. So that's why the Ionic Order, it projects stability and permanence for a sort of institution, a trading floor that really didn't have a building type. And it wasn't something people would say, oh, like this is what a stock exchange looks like. It didn't exist. So you borrow and you kind of appropriate from what people did know, which is, the past. The original Merchants Exchange was the 1840s. The addition was 1907. So the addition is actually right around the same time as the New York Stock Exchange. So it's kind of the second generation of buildings on this street and the second form. This is before skyscrapers, so the buildings are still somewhat low and more horizontal, but we're starting to edge up in the super capitalist era when buildings wanted to get much taller. And so you can see as these buildings became obsolete, they got taken over by new uses because the land is still valuable and turned into something new and different. So right now we are outside of 1 Wall Street on the corner of Wall Street and Broadway. This is obviously an Art Deco skyscraper. It follows the 1916 zoning resolution. So you notice as the building steps up, it gets smaller and smaller. This is partially to maintain light and air at the base of the building. And this is some of these competing interests that exist in downtown Manhattan, this need, because the real estate is so valuable, to essentially multiply the lot as many times as you can and charge as much rent, but then the competing public interest to preserve the public realm and make sure that we're not sacrificing the public realm for very tall buildings. And this is really one of the more perfect Art Deco skyscrapers that does this. The architect of this, Ralph Walker, really made his name doing AT&T buildings. And there's several in Tribeca, which were buildings that were all about technology and the optimism of the future. And in 1 Wall Street, he's taken a lot of those motifs and those stylized, non-historical, non-classical forms and has translated them into a very tall office building. You'll notice, unlike a more neoclassical building that would have a base, middle, and a top, in this building the lines run straight from the ground all the way up to the sky, almost as if the building is disappearing into the sky. If you look at the details of this building, it's really extraordinary. The windows in each of the tilted bays are all curved, which is something you don't really see. It's a very kind of custom, bespoke detail. When 1 Wall Street was built, it was an advertisement for the bank that built it. And so this was the most valuable piece of real estate in the country. And they bought this knowing that they wanted to build a very tall building and profess their stability, particularly because this building was going on during the Depression. They chose to go on to show, like, we are strong, we are solvent. And so building a big building during the Depression was the ultimate mark of confidence in the market and in the institutions. So a very tall building like this directly across from Trinity Church, which at the time was considered a very tall building, this is really the triumph of finance over religion. You can see this looming, tall, cascading spire of commerce directly in opposition to Trinity Church across the street. Right now we are in front of Trinity Church at the head of Wall Street in the financial district. This is actually the third Trinity Church that's existed on this site. The first one dated all the way back to 1698. It's a Gothic revival building. Trinity Church has really had a history that's mirrored a lot of the accumulation of wealth in downtown Manhattan. It's an interesting combination if you think about it's at the foot of our most famous financial center, Wall Street, but it's a church, and it's very American kind of merging of the sacred and the financial. And Trinity Church is really the perfect example of this. And as the church got wealthier, it grew. It continues to be one of the most important landlords in Manhattan. They were granted about 200 acres by Queen Anne in 1705. They still control a lot of that. As Trinity Church goes, so does Wall Street. When this was built, this was the tallest building in the country for quite some time after it was built. So you think about tall buildings, skyscrapers, and tall churches. It's kind of, again, this overlap in this paradox of Wall Street. Another interesting thing about this site is you see the pyramid right there. That's actually Alexander Hamilton, really the father of our financial system, is actually buried here at the head of Wall Street. So it's just, kind of the perfect American finance story here at Trinity Church. So we are standing in front of the Equitable building at 120 Broadway. This is really the tall building that caused the tall buildings that would follow. If you think about the forces of finance want you to multiply a floor as much as possible and get as much rent as you can. That's exactly what happened. The building is essentially a rectangle of the lot shot straight up. When this was built, people freaked out. It was so tall, so scary, that the direct resultant of this building was what's known as the 1916 zoning resolution. The setbacks that were proposed as part of the 1916 zoning resolution meant that the building needed to get smaller and smaller to make sure that enough light hits the streets, that people aren't stuck in these dark canyons, which is exactly what people felt when this was built. It's a fairly straightforward Beaux-Arts building, just kind of multiplied on top of itself forever. One of the interesting tidbits about this is that the 1916 zoning resolution created the New York Department of City Planning, who's actually currently in this building. So there's a little bit of full circleness going on here where they created the zoning resolution against the building, but then they occupy the building that their jobs created. The Beaux-Arts style is really about classism. And the architects who were working in that style were looking back towards Paris. They're looking back towards people like Vitruvius and Alberti and these books of order and classism. And you can almost see a column in the building. There's a very defined base, a shaft and then a top and a cornice. So the building both contains elements of classical architecture and the classical orders of architecture, but the building itself is also a representation of that, which is, as tall buildings became a type, people were going back and forth whether to apply historic forms and apply historic rules for buildings to them or to invent something totally new. And so this is in the more kind of reactionary historicist model as opposed to kind of the more inventive forms that came out of this. So directly next door to the Equitable Building, which created the 1916 zoning resolution, we see a more modern interpretation of a later zoning code, the 1961 zoning resolution in 140 Broadway. And in that more updated zoning, new rules came into place. Rather than just tapering, it introduced bonusing for a plaza. So this introduced these buildings, rather than a building going to the lot line and tapering up, the 1961 zoning resolution let you build taller if you would give more of the space back to the public. And so you see these towers on big plazas largely as a game to play against zoning to get a little bit more extra height through bonusing, create a plaza. It's generally a privately owned public plaza, so there are rules. It's not really a public space, but regardless, that still allowed the developer to build taller than they ordinarily would have been able to do.